Welcome you all again to this book launch for Challenging Conceptions. We're so happy that so many of you have joined us across several time zones. So introducing myself again, my name is Dr. Rhiannon Keys. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Sexual Harms and Medical Encounters, or SHAME project at Birkbeck University of London. I work on medico-legal responses to sexual violence in colonial and post-colonial Ghana and Kenya. And my role today really is to chair this event and to moderate the discussion, which I'm really looking forward to. So moving on to the reason that we're all here, I'd really love to introduce our panelists, who are all editors of the book Challenging Conceptions, which was published at the end of last year by Oxford University Press. So we're really lucky today to be joined by Dipali Anumol, Dyan Mazurana, and Kimberly Theidon. So Dipali is a doctoral candidate at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, where she earned her Master of Arts degree in Law and Diplomacy in 2019. Dyan is a research professor and the co-director of the Gender and Intersectional Analysis and Women's Leadership program at the Fletcher School, a research professor at the Friedman School of Nutrition, Science and Policy, a research fellow at the World Peace Foundation, and the research director at the Feinstein International Center at Tufts University. And Kimberly Theidon is the Henry J. Lear Professor in International Humanitarian Studies, co-director of the Gender and Intersectional Analysis and Women's Leadership program at the Fletcher School, Tufts University. So welcome to our three panelists. We are really happy to have you with us and looking forward to what promises to be a really rich and fascinating discussion. So the order of speakers will be that I'll hand over first to Kimberly, then to Dyan, and then to Dipali. So Kimberly, when you're ready, please.
Lovely. Thank you so much. And I believe we have worked out kinks, and here we go. So first of all, thank you so much for our webinar hosts, and also to all of you who are joining us today. We are really glad you are here. And is the volume good? Can you hear me well? Wonderful. Thank you. So what I would like to do today is introduce some of the themes that are woven throughout our edited volume, which includes rich case studies and research on Vietnam, Cambodia, on World War II and the Lebensborn, on Northern Uganda, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Somalia, Colombia, Mozambique, Rwanda. It is thanks to the amazing contributors of this book that we have such depth and breadth. Now, I think we all know that sometimes we select our projects and sometimes projects select us. And certainly, Cheeky was my child zero on all this. So I've conducted years of research in the Central Highlands of Peru, exploring the legacies of lethal violence among intimate enemies. And as with other civil wars, the internal armed conflict in Peru involved high levels of intra and intercommunal violence. And this terror left all sorts of legacies: distrust, rancor. It also left landscapes steeped in blood and memories, and people painfully aware of the danger that human beings can pose to one another. It also left other legacies: unwanted pregnancies and at times unwanted children. Now, some of these children were sent to live with extended family members residing outside the community, while others were raised by their mothers amid the gossip. And I recall one communal authority who bitterly complained about los regalos de los soldados, the soldiers' gifts who had been born in his pueblo. That community alone had more than 50 young people who carried only their mother's last name. Their father's identity was never determined. Over the years, I have met many children and adults who were the result of rape. And here I mentioned just one boy, my ground zero. He was a boy whose mother had been passed around by the soldiers in the base that overlooked their community for almost 15 years. And I first noticed him because he was standoffish. He never joined the growing group of children who made my room a lively and joyful place. So I tried to speak to him a few times, but he had no interest in conversation, and I respected that. But after months of living in the community, I finally had an opportunity to ask someone about this child. And it was late afternoon, and I saw him heading down the steep slope towards home. His 3 goats and 1 llama kept together with an occasional slap of a slender stick. And the woman sitting at my side knew his name, Cheeky. And obviously my face expressed my surprise because she quickly added, well, you know, his mother was one of those women. Cheeky's a painful name. for a young boy who was in turn a painful child for his mother. Cheeky means danger in Quechua, and in daily usage refers to a warning that something bad's about to happen and should be averted. People recall the ways they learned to read the signs, right, for an enemy attack. One such cheeky was when a strong wind would blow through the village, rattling the aluminum roofs, letting people know something evil was about to occur. So this boy was a future memory, a rather perverse distortion of time. He could not be a warning. It was too late for his mother to avoid this particular danger. His mere being then extends his mother's memory both to the past and to the future. And I've carried this child's story with me for so many years, unable to write him out of my memory, and thus welcome the opportunity to bring together the contributors and the co-editors of this volume to think through some of those legacies. One of the things I think that drives the book is a desire to think beyond stigma to nuance. And what about love? And this is actually something I wrote back in 2015. I was very disturbed, and I think we share this. Stigma was just used as an explanatory variable, as though somehow everything was stigma. Stigma could explain everything that we saw, and that's why they are discriminated against, the mothers, and at times, frequently their children. So one of the things we do in this book, and I think it's very important, is unpack this so that we can discover the very complex motivations that cause discrimination when it occurs. It is very different to believe that it's a child born out of wedlock, hence rejected, than it is that we think that that child is inherently evil because of how that child was conceived, or the blatantly economic motivations that I've certainly encountered where we don't want one more person inserting themselves into our inheritance lineage. We don't want to share our land. If we can begin to understand the nuance of that, think how we can work towards more effective policy responses and programming. Similarly, throughout the book, child born of war, CBOW, child born of conflict-related sexual violence. This is policy speak, important for note-hand and shorthand, but when our authors invoke these kinds of terms, we're not speaking about the age of the person per se. I know orphans who introduce themselves that way who are 60 years old. We're speaking about the circumstances of conception and birth and how the needs of these individuals change across their lifetime. The needs of that person, of course, will change as they age, but the status is one that has legacies, and they're not always tragic, but they are there. Which leads me, and I know you'll hear more about that today, what about love? That's also part of the story. Perhaps it could not be otherwise. It's also a story of love, compassion, and care that escapes this sort of blunt instrument of stigma. One of the other analytics that drives the book is life cycles, names, secrets, silences. Well, our authors explore various life cycles. Right? The life cycle of injurious names. I mean, cheeky is just one example of the naming practices that seem to be a global phenomenon. Do these injurious names have a finite lifespan? Can these people escape the taint and literally be resignified? Yes, they can. So if so, how? Some of our authors explore that. What are the intergenerational impacts of sexual violence? How is kinship reconfigured over time when some of those generations include people who've been born as a result of this kind of violence? So life cycles of people, of names, of life circumstances is one of the analytics that drives the book. Another is the idea of making kin. Another very rich area of inquiry is the idea of local biologies. Although DNA and genetic codes, as you see there, animate scientific discussions of inherited traits, local biologies are more apt to involve bodily fluids, toxic memories, perhaps wounds of the soul. Looking comparatively, our authors explore some of the characteristics theorized to pass from parent to child via blood, semen, breast milk, or in utero. We want to challenge patriarchal biologies to foreground that there's also a maternal contribution to that child. We need to move beyond and challenge this rigid patriarchal way of understanding kin and offspring that is grounded in that seminal violence as though it can fix a fate. reducing women to little more than occupied wombs. And what about the men? Well, I don't think this is a big surprise. The reproductive subject remains overwhelmingly female. It is the potentially pregnant, currently pregnant, perhaps fertile, birthing, or post-delivery woman. It's women and girls. I think that's why we have much more reproductive governance than we do justice. Where are the men? Where there is a pregnancy, this is a newsflash, I'm glad you're seated, there's sperm. So our contributors offer insights into this woefully understudied area. I want us to move beyond what I call uterine myopia and look at distributed reproduction that goes far beyond in the individual uterus. What about the men? Our chapters offer some, I think, very surprising insights into these fathers. And then, and I'm sure you'll hear more about this from Dipali, just as you'll hear about love and care from Dyan. But what about statecraft? And at times, the odds, the logic of the state is so at odds with the flexible kinship, with the ways in which people can use ambivalence in powerful ways. When a document demands that someone name their father, when the law of the father is exercised in such a way that you have to have his identity to enroll in college, to be a citizen in your nation state, the law of the father can become a site of potentially painful disclosures. I'm sure you'll hear more about that from my colleagues. And then let's think about the Women, Peace, and Security agenda and its various resolutions. I'm thinking here of 2122 that specifically addresses the need to access to a full range of sexual and reproductive health services, including those regarding pregnancies resulting from rape, etc. There is not a word about abortion, the right to safe, accessible contraception and abortion. Now, I think there's an enduring silence. I understand that for those within the UN network, for many international and perhaps domestic NGOs, there is a donor-imposed silence here. So those of us who can do so must demand that that full range of sexual and reproductive rights includes the right to terminate a pregnancy that is unplanned and or unwanted. I hope that we continue to be better allies to these women. There's also UN Security Resolution 2467. How am I doing on time? Okay, all right.
You're good, Kimberly.
Beg your pardon?
You're fine for time. You're doing well.
Thank you. Because I wanted to know if I had to start talking faster. So in 2019, to mark the 20th anniversary of the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda's foundational Resolution 1325, the UN Security Council proposed Resolution 2467. Now, the resolution recognizes, quote, women and girls who become pregnant as a result of sexual violence and armed conflict, including those who choose to become mothers, may have different and specific needs, and advocates, quote, a survivor-centered approach that recognizes the needs of survivors of sexual violence to receive non-discriminatory access to a full range of services. Now, the original language included references to sexual and reproductive health, triggering vocal opposition from the United States and the Right to Life bloc. I insist on calling them forced birth extremists. And when the US threatened to veto the resolution, it was watered down and the offending words are omitted. As of someone who sits here in the United States speaking with you today, I suspect that one reason children born of wartime rape have and remain to some extent invisible is because there is no reasonable way to discuss this issue from a survivor-centered perspective without addressing a woman's right to abortion. And that is made extraordinarily difficult by certain key, powerful nation states in this world. I highly respect the Women, Peace, and Security agenda and all of the accomplishments it allowed us to make. But mainstreaming gender can be a double entendre, as a more feminist critique of policies mainstreamed into something that's more palatable to the status quo or to powerful countries. There are times when are simply competing rights regimes of a woman and the fetus located within her. And as I will say at the end, I think this calls for an explicitly feminist agenda on these issues. I want then to think a bit about the platform for action promoting the rights and well-being of children born of conflict-related sexual violence. It's a very important document that does have rich detail and is written from a place of tremendous compassion. And it also includes this line. Right, I'm having trouble seeing my own lines. There you go. I'm moving my friends over here. On page 18 is a line that disturbs me deeply. You can see it right there. Women and girls who become pregnant as a result of conflict-related sexual violence do not give birth to the children are beyond the scope of this platform. We know why. I've already said so, but I think we all know. But I hope that all of this silence around what we require of women, at times, I think, in the case of unwanted and unplanned pregnancies, we ask women to hold up the entire sky. So I hope these women are not, although out of the platform, are not beyond our circle of compassion and care. Oops. And this is why I repeat, I think we need an explicitly feminist approach to these issues. A gender and intersectional analysis is key, but we need an explicitly feminist agenda on these issues. Allyship will demand that of us. I think we need a comprehensive gendered and feminist theory of harm that goes far beyond penetrative acts of sexual violence, although certainly those are included. In addition to sexual violence and the hypervisibilization that it has achieved on the international stage, there's gender-based violence, there's reproductive violence, and there's obstetric violence being exercised even while we sit here today in painful ways in Gaza and elsewhere. So my final is to suggest that if some of what we say today speaks to you, and hopefully it will, and that you will speak to us, that you can follow the Gender and Intersectional Analysis program at the Fletcher School. Thank you, and I want to turn it over to my colleagues.
Thank you so much, Kimberly, for that really rich and wide-ranging introduction, which I think situates the rest of the discussion really well. So just handing to Dyan next for the next presentation. Thank you so much. Sorry, Dyan, you're muted.
Unmuted now, yes?
Yes.
Great. All right. Thank you, Kimberly, for that really rich introduction to the book. So like Kimberly, I've been working with children who are born of conflict-related sexual violence and their mothers for over 25 years. And it was over the last several years that Kimberly and I and Dipali had these discussions about needing to bring forward more of what is known about the mothers, the fathers, and these children. And so in this book, we brought together researchers, 18 actually, other scholars, practitioners, and some of our contributors are also mothers of children born of rape, to present what we hope is the most comprehensive and current research findings on these children and their communities. And the book is based on years of field-based research in 16 countries. And it presents information on how these children see themselves, how their families and communities view and treat them, and how they experience their lives. And what we're really interested in this book is how these children make meaning from their own experiences of violence and how their meaning making is used to profoundly shape their communities and nations. So the book is incredibly rich. And I really encourage you to take a look at it if you are interested in this topic. I just want to share with you one of the cases from our book, which really shows the power of adolescent children who are born of conflict-related sexual violence when they're supported and loved in understanding their conception stories and how this affects their relationship to their mothers, their communities, and actually their countries. So children of shame, children of bad memories, children of the enemy. People use these names to describe the children in their communities whose origin is rape of their mothers by the enemy during the war. Academics label them children born of war, and media and scholarly reports use the words despised, ostracized, rejected, and abused to portray their lives. Now, most accounts of these children leave our hearts aching as we learn of the abuse and deprivation that they and their mothers face in their daily lives. And the children seem particularly damaged and incapable of changing their cruel fate. Surely, given this, they'd be among the last people we would turn to when looking for help for their communities and their nations to solve the serious problems that they face in the post-conflict. But a small number and a growing number of researchers, myself, Kimberly, Dipali, and our co-authors among them, contend that these are in fact the very young people whose stories and views must be written down, reflected upon, and shared. and that their voices and participation are vital to both their nations and actually to the world. Skeptical? I was too at first, before I started paying attention to the children and youth affected by war, not with an ear to their horrors and struggles, of which there are many, but instead with an eye to the fact that so many of them were even there to tell their stories, living their lives with dignity and determination. And many of them were making a positive difference. Some were reaching their family members and neighbors who had shunned them. Others were reaching thousands of people, and they were transforming lives. So Hannah is a young woman from the city of Sarajevo in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Hannah is a child born of war. In the wars that resulted from the breakup of Yugoslavia between 1991 and 1995, Bosnian Muslims were subjected to vicious attacks and ethnic cleansing by Serbian nationalist forces. To destroy Bosniak families and societies, Serbian forces intentionally and systematically raped and forcibly impregnated between 25,000 and 40,000 Bosniak women and girls. Serbian men with uniforms and guns told their victims that their children would be Serbian and would turn against their Bosniak mothers and communities, continuing their destruction. And even today, the women who survived this experience continue to suffer emotional, spiritual, and physical harm. I came to know Hannah's story through one of the book's authors, Tatiana Taksiva, a professor of English language and literature and women and gender studies at St. Mary's University in Canada. Tatiana is herself from the Balkans, and over many years of careful work in the region has built deep, trusting relations with some of the Bosniak mothers who bore children due to being raped by Serbian nationalist soldiers. Hannah spoke with Tatiana about her understanding of her identity, how it grew over time, and its transformative potential. Hannah explains, quote, "The main trigger was one professor in junior high. It was unbelievable to me that I did not know the answer to one question he asked about my father's name. This is because I knew that my stepfather was not my biological father. That set me off. I felt like I didn't have a solid ground under my feet. I think that if it didn't happen, I might have gone in a different direction, and I don't know when my mother would have chosen to told me. If I met that professor now, I would thank him for asking me that question, and I would tell him the name because I know the name now. That's how much detail I went in my search." I started to engage in activism when I started to search for my own identity. I was 14 at the time. I didn't know about my origins since my mother never told me, so I started searching through activism, something that I'm involved in to this day as a feminist. My mother told me the details, but before that, I found some of her paperwork. I knew she was going to a psychologist, so I put two and two together, but I didn't say anything at first. I worked with my mother on that. I know a lot about my biological father, and this is lucky. I searched for a lot of details, but I never felt the need to. I can't say that I had a desire for revenge, but I did have moments when I really hated him, and I spent a lot of time getting cured from that feeling. I realized I cannot go on hating, and I cannot go to sleep at night and wake up in the morning with hatred inside me. My mother always told me that I should not hate, and that if I do, it would be as if I hate myself. Her words make me realize only now the kind of upbringing she provided for me from the start. It was special. After I found out who I was and how I arrived in this world, I had a very difficult period. There were psychologists involved. It was very difficult for my mother and me. A lot happened before my mother and I finally sat and talked. Before that happened, I spoke to my school counselor, a psychologist, to the principal. It was very difficult for my mother. She takes a lot of pills and suffers from migraines. Finally, my mother and I went together to the psychologist and started working on all of it together. That really sped up the process and we opened up more. I needed a lot of time to understand that my mother loves me and that I am her all and she is my all. She is everything to me. Sorry. She is a lioness when it comes to protecting me. It's very powerful. She always wanted people to understand that I am a child and that I am worth the same as all children. And she never let me feel that I am different or that I don't belong. This process helped. I explained things to myself in such a way that I managed to empower myself, and I wanted to empower my mother so that it empowers us together. I was alone when I found out about my case. Even my friends from Zenica, with whom I grew up, I only found out about them much later. I now believe that none of this is a reason to be ashamed. We're not alone in this. I thought that it would be sad when the 15 of us got together in that room, but it was not. We even managed to laugh. We exchanged experiences about problems we face in our municipality, and we felt understood by each other. You can do a lot if you're connected to people. If people could hear me, I would like to tell them that they're not alone and that there is someone who can understand them, since it is very hard otherwise. It means a lot when I meet someone and I'm able to tell them. It was difficult for my mother and I when we first started talking to each other about this, but we did it together and we always do it together. And this is such a relief. I would like for people to know what happened, not to avoid it and not to minimize it. It seems unbelievable to me that there are no statistics of people like me, that human lives are forgotten and cannot be accounted for. So the ethnic divisions and the intensified ethnic cleansing and the wars continue to scar the nations of Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, the Republic of Srpska, and Serbia. Ethno-nationalism drives politics in all of these countries today. And in fact, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, the constitution, which was validated by other nations, only allows its citizens to identify as Bosniak, Croat, Serb, or other. No hybrid identities, no space or word for young people like Hannah. Silence, erasure. And yet, Hannah, and many thousands like her, by their very being, expose the fallacy of those singular ethno-national identities that are imposed by political leaders and the cynical bargains they strike with one another to divide people and divide the land. Yet Hannah's active refusal to disappear and be silenced shows that human identity can never be restricted to the arbitrary fiat of a politician or bureaucrats, and that human hope will always burst out of those striped jackets. Thus freed, it's possible to find ways to move into a more inclusive and hopeful future. Finally, communities and families strongly influence how children and youth, along with their identities that they have either taken up or have had imposed upon them, are positioned to emerge from war and political violence into so-called peacetime. The societies that these young people now reside in are forever changed. In so many ways, the genie is out of the bottle, and the children, youth, and their societies will never go back to what they were before. The real question then becomes, can communities and societies grow beyond the war to include and even embrace these young people and all the complexity that they bring with them? Do these societies fall backwards so that even once the guns have fallen silence, they continue to play out the war in their homes and villages on the bodies and spirits of these children and youth, thus poisoning it all and everything that might have been? Or can they move forward together with a new collective understanding of who they are, what they survived, and what they're capable of, and what they aspire to? Thank you. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dipali.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Dyan, for those really powerful words. I just want to situate my comments today around a very simple giveaway or takeaway to you. That it doesn't matter just that we do this work, this research, this policy, this programming, but it matters that we do it well. And in terms of that, I would like to sort of focus on three little buckets today: policy and programming, research, and theory building. The first is policy or programming. So through the multitude of case studies with researchers, practitioners, people on the ground, we've sort of seen something. The most important thing in terms of practical policy matters is to think about a sequencing of programming that is available to the mothers, the fathers, and the children. What we've seen that is important in Cambodia, in Rwanda, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, is that we need psychological and psychosocial support for mothers, for children, and for potential fathers, and greater community programming around behavioral change, acceptance, and love. So once we think about psychosocial support, we can move on to thinking about the question of disclosure. Disclosure around why these children were born, what brought out, what circumstances were important to it, and what the legacy of that is. Disclosure should always, and this is something we learned on the ground in Rwanda, disclosure should always be the final decision of the mother, not the community, not the father, not a policy programmer, not an activist, the mother. Once the mothers are in a place of acceptance, they can make the disclosure themselves to children. Of course, organizations on the ground can help to create spaces, safe spaces for these conversations, but disclosure is always the right of the mother. Once disclosure has happened, it is important to also have psychological support through community activism, through support groups for mothers and children together to repair potential differences, to find potential commonalities, and to find a way forward. So once we think about psychosocial support, we should also think about economic support. Because one thing that we see across the chapters in this book and across the contributors and case studies, whether in Uganda, whether in the Caliphate, whether in Somalia or Kenya, is that there are cycles of harm here, not only in terms of conception, not only in terms of ostracization or potential stigma once these children are born, but also knock-on effects of living in a patriarchal system and a capitalist system. So this means the lack of a father, meaning not having a primary breadwinner in the group, which could change gender roles, for example, where women are made to go work instead. Or the children are not given, because children do not have enough education or enough access to resources, they are forced to work and drop out of school. So we need to think about these interconnected harms and cycles of harms and think about multiplier effects that they potentially could have and work through them. So psychological support, economic support. And the third is government or bureaucratic support. So one of the biggest takeaways from this book is that there is an issue with documentation. It's something as simple as that. The fact that your father's name is required to be able to register for national identity, to be able to register for national exams. And if you don't have your father's name, you cannot register. So if we can move away from patrilineal sources of information and allow children and allow these families to be able to make the choice when they can disclose or if they disclose, and take it away from this bureaucratic assumption that you need to always know your mother's name and your father's name, we can move towards a more collaborative, a more open system of lineage, of inheritance, of education, of bureaucracy. And then moving on to the international level, we need to think about long-term funding for these projects, long-term funding for these programs on the ground. We also need to think about large-scale reparations projects on behalf of governments, on behalf of international agencies towards these mothers and women. In terms of then moving on to how we do the research around this, we need to know that there is a difference between the story we know and the story we need to know. So we need a survivor-centered and feminist approach, as Kimberly and Dyan both stressed. We need to go into this with a sense of feminist curiosity. That is the notion to make everything into something that is questionable, to ask what we take seriously, to move beyond the dyad of victim, perpetrator, survivor, deceased, mother, child, and to think about thick description. We need to move beyond speaking for, and I think the case studies in this book illustrate really well, move from speaking for to speaking with and speaking to. So moving beyond an extractive notion of research to a more collaborative notion of research, where it is deeply ethnographic and gives room to nuance and gives room to the realities and practical living that exists on the ground. We also think about narrative, as Tatiana Takseva shows us in her cases in Bosnia, narrative as an act of personal agency, moving beyond thinking about children through the words of adults, but towards thinking about children through their own words and through their own actions. We need to move beyond monolithic and homogenized conceptions of victimhood, motherhood, and childhood. We need to account for the active agency of children and move towards child-centered research. Something really interesting, if you look at the case studies, for example, in Colombia, in Somalia, and Kenya in the book, is that sometimes children speak about their fathers with longing, with love. So I would urge you to then think about the question Angela Lederach asks us. What is seen and made possible when we widen the frame and focus the lens on life and love rather than limit the field of vision to death and suffering? And I think that's something that this book makes very clear. One, that love and care matter to people when they're remaking their lives in the wake of violence. And two, and most importantly, that our study and understanding of those experiences will be different if we take these dimensions seriously. So we need to move beyond damage-centered research to desire-centered research, which allows a space for complexity, contradiction, and self-determination. We need to think about practices of love, care, and survivance, spaces that are ones of synthesis and renewal, ones of survival and resistance, and ones that outwit the dyad of dominance versus victimhood. So ultimately, I would say we need to listen to the words of Mary Oliver. We need to pay attention, be astonished, and we need to tell about it. And in doing so, we can do justice with words and with actions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dipali, and thank you so much to Dyan and Kimberly for your really powerful and moving presentations and an introduction to the book. So if I may, I'd like to just take a few minutes to, I think, pull out some of the themes from today's discussion, whilst kind of noting that it's incredibly difficult, I think, to give anything more than a snapshot within the time that we've had of the incredibly rich and informative contents of the book, which is so wide-ranging across space and time and incorporates diverse case studies across continents from Vietnam, Nazi Germany and occupied Europe, Colombia, Uganda, Syria, Rwanda, Somalia, and so on. So I'd therefore encourage all participants to really read the book. It's a challenging, but I think a really necessary read for anyone who's interested in these questions. So I think reflecting on the book, much I think has been written about sexual violence in wartime, in part influenced by international legal recognitions of rape as a crime against humanity and as a tool of genocide, following judgments in international tribunals responding to violence in Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. So this literature has really grown alongside a growing attention to sexual violence in war, with Kerry Crawford's work tracing how international concerns over sexual violence in conflict have shifted over time. So immediately following the Second World War, which is, I think, the earliest case study in your book, rape was considered heinous but inevitable during war, and so didn't warrant formal prosecution at Nuremberg nor much international condemnation. With a combination of transnational human rights and women's rights advocacy and the news of atrocities in the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, which are also covered so ably in the book, the international silence began to give way to demands for accountability, with rape beginning to be framed as a weapon of war and an issue of international security, and firmly placed onto the international legal agenda. But what this increased attention to gender violence in war hasn't resulted in is a corresponding consideration to what Kimberly's introduction to the book describes as the potential and obvious outcomes of such violence, so pregnancy, abortion, childbirth, and related questions of reproductive justice. So where children born of wartime sexual violence exist within the literature, as Charlie Carpenter has shown, they're often invisibilized as victims in their own right, and often considered only in connection with their relationship to their mother as a physical embodiment and permanent reminder of the sexual harms done to her. Meanwhile, international legal and humanitarian responses are often blunt, one-size-fits-all interventions with little attention to historical context or to local social and cultural specificities. And I think what this book does so deftly is to treat children born of war as individuals, so recognizing that they may have needs distinct from their mothers. So the book really troubles the still prevalent sort of women and children paradigm in discussions of gender in war, and builds on Cynthia Enlow's really important work in this area. It also pushes back against the tropes prevalent in popular and academic presentations of such children as rejected or stigmatized by their communities, as all three of our contributors have said. So whilst not shying away from the very real difficulties and harms faced by children born of wartime sexual violence as they're reintegrated into peacetime communities, the book complicates this paradigm to show that there isn't a single experience. So through attention to local specificities, the chapters show that there are a range of responses to children born of wartime violence, depending on pre-existing social relations, particularly gender and kinship relational structures. So it really troubles the divide between war and peacetime in a way that's, I think, really impactful. So attention to specific context therefore complicates prevalent discourses about children born of war, which allows for more nuanced understandings. I think crucially, the book's unpacking of the category of children born of wartime sexual violence allows for the recognition of a multiplicity of experiences, which change according to historical and geographical location, but also within the lifespan of particular individuals, as the chapter on Amerasian children demonstrates, I think, so ably. Recognizing these complexities, the book also recognizes that children born of wartime sexual violence aren't simply stigmatized, rejected pariahs, but are historical and social actors in their own right, with various chapters emphasizing their agency and resistance to oppressive discourses and social practices, and shows the ways that they negotiate kinship and community relationships, as well as affecting really important political change. Understanding these variations shows how we might more effectively connect the local to the global, as Mwadi Mukenge has called for. And it's perhaps here that the most striking contribution of the book, I think, and the most promising for influencing interventions is evidence. As Bridget Connolly's chapter reminds us, the past cannot be forgotten, but it's not determinative of the future. And violence is not destiny, as Apio also states in the book. And it isn't understanding the multiplicity of experiences of harms, but also of more inclusive and accepting responses and more positive experiences that I think we can find both sources of hope and indications of how things can be otherwise. So I'd just like to end my contributions by thanking the three editors for bringing together this really wonderful collection.